What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Mindful Muscle Podcast. Today, we have an awesome guest today, Dr. Kasey Ordvidas. And Kasey, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm super excited to have you on because I love mindset, I love psychology, and its intersection with health and fitness. So I couldn't think of anyone better than you to talk to about.
Yeah, that's all my favorite stuff too. Everything I do, I try to mishmash those things together. So I'm excited to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So a little bit of background on you. You grew up in Minnesota. At what point were you like, man, this psychology stuff is that the route that you wanted to go?
Yeah, honestly, high school. So I had my first, I'm sure a lot of people are this way too. I took an AP psychology class in high school, and that was my first introduction to psych as a science. And I think part of it was, I should actually probably send this guy an email, honestly, but part of it was my teacher. He was just awesome. The way that he presented everything and explained everything really made me very much so interested in the science of human behavior and what that means for so many different avenues of life. So he piqued my interest for sure. And he would definitely be happy to know that I went all the way to get a PhD. So I should send that email. But that kind of piqued my interest. And then when I went to college, it might have been, it's probably this way for a lot of people. They make you choose a major right off the bat, even if it's going to change. They're like, it's not set in stone, just pick something. Because I knew I was interested in psychology, I was like, okay, well, let's say psychology for now. And I really didn't assume that that's what I would stay with. I was like, there's no way that that thing that I was interested in high school actually becomes what I do for long term. But I tried out different areas and tested different majors and classes and things like that. And nothing just seemed interesting enough to me. So I stuck with psychology. I originally was really interested in criminal psychology and forensic psychology. Wanted to be a prison warden for a good chunk of time, which is a totally different direction than where I am now. But did fall in love with health and fitness around my sophomore or junior year for myself, and really started to kind of think, how can this psych stuff really blend with health and fitness? And how do I get more people to really see how beneficial strength training can be, or fueling your body properly, and how that can show up in all these different areas of your life, and all this great stuff. But so many people weren't doing it. And we all know, it's more than just education. People know they should exercise and eat healthy, but people aren't doing it. There's a psychology component to it. So that's kind of what drove me to grad school, to kind of dive into those topics a little bit more.
Yeah. And now you work with hundreds of women, you and your team, you coach women, and I know you coach men as well, but around probably the biggest topic is going to be weight loss and body composition. And so I'd love to dive into some of the things that you've seen in even just someone being mentally ready for weight loss, and whether that is needing to reverse diet or being ready to approach weight loss from a smart, scientific-based process. And so talk a little bit about the way in which you will go and educate people, both from a research standpoint, anecdotal standpoint, application standpoint, and what some of the initial things that you want to instill, whether that is a growth mindset or just education, to help people get to a place to where they're ready for that physical and ultimately mental transformation.
Yeah, that's a really good question to kind of kickstart things, because I also think it's often overlooked too. People are like, oh, I want to lose weight, so I'm going to just dive into a diet. And there are so many other boxes we need to check first, not only just from sort of a physical and physique standpoint, and understanding that so many women especially are chronically dieting and yo-yo dieting, and in a deficit, out of a deficit, in a deficit, out of a deficit. And that's not great from a metabolic perspective, and definitely does not set you up for success when you're okay, well, now I'm going to dive into a deficit again, but also that in and of itself can take a toll on your mindset. But where your mindset is at in general, and how you sort of see dieting and see your body and see what that means to you, can also really determine the trajectory of your success or lack thereof. So it really is a foundational piece, is understanding what certain things mean to you, whether that's dieting, whether that's exercise or healthy eating. One person may say oh, well, exercise is used for punishment, after I've eaten poorly, and nutrition means nothing to me. It's just I eat whatever I want, whenever I want. Whereas someone else may say exercise is sort of my me time. It's for my mental health just as much as it is my physical health. And nutrition is something that I take very seriously because it supports like my daily energy levels and how I show up for my family. Two totally different perspectives and meaning making about the exact same things, right? And I bet you can probably guess like who's going to be the one who's more successful with like sticking with exercise and healthy eating, right? So as a coach, and I've been coaching for about 7 years now, and also have a team of coaches at KJO Coaching. That's something that we focus very, very heavily on, and is also kind of like my goal is to get more coaches to focus on this, like through that certification program that I run, is to really determine, okay, well, where is your mindset at sort of at a baseline, right? And what do these things mean to you? And like your goals, like what does that mean to you? What do you value? What do you prioritize? Do those things match? There's so many different directions you can go, but kind of all in all, just like determining what that like baseline mindset looks like is super, super important.
Yeah, totally. And I'd be curious your perspective. If we were to define terms, how do you approach mindset, and almost from a definition standpoint, so that people listening and myself even are on the same page as to what you're talking about? Because you'll see mental performance, you'll see mindset, you'll see meditation, all these words kind of get thrown around. And what is the best frame to look at that? So then from there, we can go and start on an even playing field. And then I'd love for you to talk about maybe ways where you maybe grade where people should be at from a mindset standpoint, whether that is in your certification or working with clients.
Yeah. So defining mindset, that it is funny because it's become just so popular in such like a pop culture, pop psychology type of thing to talk about. And you see it, all the time. There's, when I hashtag growth mindset on Instagram, there's literally like 8 million posts related to that, right? So it's definitely something that's become very popular. And I think a lot of times in like the just general like no days off type of culture too, there's a lot of that like, oh, just like this like tough mindset type of culture, when in reality, like we know too that you don't need that in order to be successful. But it also is just like allowed people to kind of take it and define it in a lot of different ways, and it does end up getting like kind of coupled and put together with things like manifestation and just like positive vibes and all of this stuff. Just believe in yourself, when there really is so much more to it, and truly like a bunch of evidence-based practices. And like I wouldn't have a PhD if there wasn't a science to mindset, right? So how I define it and how generally it's defined in the literature is that it is essentially like the lens that you take to see the world through and assign meaning to things and make sense of situations. So that is the very broad sort of blanket definition of mindset. And then you can kind of like take that down to the next level of growth versus fixed mindset. So that is something that is specifically coined by Dr. Carol Dweck, which a lot of people are familiar with, based on her book, literally called Mindset. It's a New York Times bestseller. But she kind of coined that term to kind of determine the two different sides of mindset. So, and ultimately the definition there for growth versus fixed mindset is we're looking at whether or not someone believes that they could change. So someone with a growth mindset believes that even though on their hardest days, they still believe that they can change. That's still there. Whereas someone with a fixed mindset, like on those hard days, that's just evidence that they can't change, right? They're like, I knew it all along type of thing. So what's tough is that with a fixed mindset, you don't always realize that you do have one, and it's what's the culprit and is holding you back towards being more successful. But those are kind of like the blanket terms there that I'll use a lot and more like definitions. And as far as like a grading scale on this and like how do we determine, if a client has a growth versus fixed mindset, it does look so different depending on the person. So that does make it hard. Absolutely. There are assessments out there. I use them in my research, right? To determine like where do people fall sort of on this continuum, which that's important to note is that it is a continuum from growth to fixed. It's not like you're 110% growth mindset or you're 110% fixed mindset. You very much so can fall on this continuum. And what we do see is for the most part, people lean towards having a growth mindset, but how far you lean kind of determines like where your mindset is at. It's not like you're fixed, you're growth. Absolutely, there are some statements that you may be like saying to yourself or saying like outwardly that are indicative of a growth or a fixed mindset, or your actions might like be indicative of a growth or a fixed mindset. But most people fall somewhere on this continuum, and for the most part do lean a little bit more towards growth. But there's always room for improvement, right? So for the most part, when it comes to working with clients, it's not that we are even looking to be like, okay, this is where you're at on the spectrum. It's what does this look like for you, right? Like what meaning are you assigning to things? Like how are you making sense of these situations? And what does that mean for your overall goal achievement and your goal pursuit, right? Because if someone sees weight loss as something that is really difficult for them, something that they likely will never be able to do, that every time they try something, nothing works for them. They've tried all of the different options out there and nothing seems to stick. That is going to be more fixed mindset oriented, right? So anytime we're like, hey, let's try this, or what about this strategy? What's going to come up for them is that, I mean, I can, but chances are it's not going to work, right? And when you feel that way and have that sort of fixed mindset outlook, you're going to be so much less likely to want to put effort forth, because why put effort forth towards something that you're likely not going to be able to do anyway? Like that's silly, right? Like who would want to do that? Like I know I'm not going to be successful. Why would I try? But again, people don't even realize that they're doing that. So determining if that's the case is important from like a coaching perspective, but it's more or less like, we don't even like do this at KJO where mindset is a really, really big pillar in what we do for our coaching. Like we don't say like, here's an assessment, let's see where you land. It's more like we're listening for specific words, for phrases, the way that clients like present things or talk about things, or when they try things, how they end up reacting to it if it doesn't go well or if it does go well. So that's what we're kind of looking for, to like, oh, I heard a little bit of like a fixed mindset situation there. Like I'm going to pay attention to that. And then we'll cater our coaching to that type of mindset, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. And I always think back to different times playing sports where I'd have coaches who would just take one perspective of, I'm just going to yell at you to get you to go where I want you, versus someone who maybe is more curious and trying to help you come to that right answer, whether that is through motivational interviewing and being able to have the client arrive at the thing that's best for them. You had an interesting post a few weeks ago where it was just memories over macros. And you've said the word meaning a lot of times. And I think that's something that is super interesting just around the concept of labels and associating meaning with a word. And because you believe that tracking macros is restrictive, then in a way it already is this fixed mindset about it, as opposed to, well, what would it look like if you did track your macros for 2 weeks? And does tracking macros have a one-to-one correlation with not having any fun? Be curious to have you talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Oh, this is such a good discussion. Yeah. Because something I say frequently is that it's not just semantics, it's not just words. The words mean something to you, and that's why you chose to use that word a lot of the time. Right. Of course, yeah, to some degree, like tomato, tomato, but in this situation, like that's not the case. So what you are deciding something means can make a difference for you. So the whole, like, you've heard these phrases before that's like, oh, memories over macros. So I'm just going to, not track this weekend and just enjoy myself. It's like, why does it have to be memories or macros? And like, what's that in that post, right? I talked about, well, what's the alternative? It's like macros and no memories. Like that sucks. Like, is that really what we are shooting for here? If we're not tracking macros, we're making memories. If we're making memories, then we can't track macros. Like that's just not the case, right? It's very much sort of like an all or nothing perspective, when in reality, there is such a strong gray area here. And I kind of explained in that post too, like from my personal experience, I've traveled around the world while tracking macros, and I can tell you that it didn't impact the memories that I was making, right? But it is just like all comes down to like your mindset, your perspective, and the meaning that you're assigning to these things. So yeah, absolutely. There are people who are like, I've never tracked macros before, but like my perspective of it and my take on it is that it is something that's restrictive and is going to keep me from living my life to the best of my ability and to the fullest, when that doesn't need to be true. But if that's what you're telling yourself and that's the belief that you hold, like you're not gonna want to track macros. I would want to track macros if that was the case. Like I would never do that if that's like actually how it would play out, right? So that's where, yeah, really just like checking yourself with a lot of these things and like, where did these beliefs come from? Why do you hold them? Who told you this at one point? Or why did you put these things together? What experiences did you have? Like it's really, really important to become more aware of the meaning that you do assign to those things and why.
Yeah. And that's something that I've seen on multiple people in the fitness industry. Jordan Duggar is someone I saw, I think I've seen you talk about it, where it's the questions you can ask yourself of, is this true? And what if the opposite was true? Or is this empowering? And really just question the source of that thought. I had another gal on, and she was talking about the concept of, 1,200 calories, right? If you need to lose weight, just 1,200 calories. And that was something that she had got from her mother. And she talked about how a lot of women that she'd worked with get this number of 1,200 from their mother, who would have gotten it from diet advice in the 80s, in the 70s. And
hilarious.
just pulling that root of like, where did this thought come from? Because until you address that, it's going to just keep growing. And so the all or nothing thing is something too that I personally sometimes will run into. Like, if I don't have 2 hours to nap, it's not worth taking a nap. And so I don't know if that's the case for you, but it's something where I'll see a lot of, times with clients, or even with what we were just talking about with macros, where if they can't do it 100%, if they don't have an hour to work out, well, what's the point? And I know that's something you talk about in your 5-day course. And so what are some of the approaches or even mindsets that people can take around this all or nothing, and getting out of this really rigid black or white, like failure, not failure? And one last thing I'll toss out is, I saw an image, it was like a meme, something on social media, where it was talking about effort, and it was a picture of the waxing and waning of a moon. And so it's like, some days it's a full moon, some days it's a quarter moon, some days it's a half moon. And it's like, this is all effort, as opposed to just, it's either a full moon or no moon.
Love that. Yeah. And that's a perspective people need to take, right? Easier said than done. And all or nothing thinking, I think, is one of those things that I hear come up the most. I think people understand what that means, and they understand how they will do that, where it's like, oh, I'm going to have just one drink, like JK, that turned into like 5 drinks and dessert. And then we went out and grabbed like pizza at midnight and all of these things. When in reality, like, why couldn't it have just been that one drink, like you planned? But there's this sort of, they call it the what the hell effect in the literature. So this is literally what researchers are calling it. That idea of like, what the hell, I already like screwed up. I might as well like just, there goes the whole day, right? Or the week or the trip or whatever that may look like. So it's funny that you bring this up, because I think it connects a lot to what we were just talking about, is like better understanding like why you have that thought and that perspective in the first place. And that could be really, really powerful to understand, because it could be the very same thing, right? Oh, my mom told me that 1,200 calories is what it needs to be for dieting. So anytime I go over 1,200 calories, even by 50, like I blow it and I eat 2,300 calories, because like what I've always been told is like, this is the amount. So any more might as well be 1,000 calories more versus 30. It doesn't make a difference. So understanding though where that comes from is helpful. Obviously, from an education perspective, we can be like, that's not the case. Like, number one, you probably can be eating more than 1,200 calories. And the reason why you do go overboard in those situations is because you're eating too little to begin with. So you can kind of have like that educational discussion and really start to like abolish some of those like long-standing beliefs that you do have. But for other people, it may take a little bit more time and understanding to realize like, where is this coming from? Why am I doing this? Like, what is triggering this behavior for me to feel this way? It's interesting too, because it kind of sometimes ties into just like aspects of self-control. Like, people feel like that lack of control is what's causing them to have these all or nothing events, right? And that can also tie back to like a 1,200 calorie thing, because what I've noticed a lot in working with women, it's like, I don't have self-control. But the reality is you're just like eating so little. Like, no one's gonna be able to have self-control when you're like trying to eat like 1,200 calories a day and like work out twice a day and do all of these other things. Your self-control is going to be very, very, very little at that point. So I think determining, I guess this whole conversation wrapped up is like determining where those thoughts are coming from in the first place. That's how you can actually address them, because otherwise it's just like, stop doing it, right? Like, that's not helpful. Like, we need to know why you're doing it in the first place. We can't change what we don't know needs changing. We can't improve what we don't know needs improving. There needs to be a little bit more of like a discussion around there. And I know that feels like kind of like a cop-out answer, but it's true. Like, it looks so different depending on the person. And once you can get a better idea of like, why am I doing this in the first place? Or where is this belief stemming from? And honestly, it can go deep really quick. Like, this could be like I don't think I'm like worthy enough to actually lose weight and to feel good in my body, right? So that's why you're doing some of these like quote unquote self-sabotaging things, like having all or nothing thinking or losing self-control or having a fixed mindset, whatever that looks like, can actually all be rooted in this core belief that like you don't actually believe that you're worth achieving this goal, which is like, I know that seems like super deep and that like went really deep really fast, but it's the truth. And that's like where all the time, coaches that I work with, they're like, oh, I feel like a life coach more than I do a health and fitness coach. I'm like, this is why, this stuff is not just health and fitness. It's not just macros and strength training. It is like this person's life, and everything that goes on in their life is tied into their health and fitness. You can't really like separate the mind and the body and like their core beliefs and all of this stuff.
Yeah. And I think it is super interesting, the line between a coach that is getting someone to, have a growth mindset looking forward. And this is a frame that I heard from someone else on a podcast, but they were talking about, you have your counselors that look back. So that would be therapy and looking at, what at 6 years old, how do you think you're not worthy? And then you have your community, which is your environment, your current environment. And then I'm curious to your thoughts on this. The coach's job is to say, cool, like what can we create as a North Star to move towards? And like kind of almost in like the future in a frame. And so even just the idea of like scope of practice, because it does totally straddle that line of, oh, I'm trying to, eat better. And then all of a sudden you get some sort of like childhood trauma if you do keep digging. And so at what point is it like, hey, cool, like this is something that would be great for you to work with a professional about?
Yeah. And that's something that comes up every single cohort inside the health mindset coaching certification. Because we are quite literally talking about evidence-based practices that stem from psychology, but like these people are not psychologists for the most part, right? And like, I'm a psychologist, but I'm a research psychologist. I'm not trained as a clinical psychologist. So I can't necessarily like help people from like a therapeutic perspective still. So yeah, there absolutely is a line, and we need to know where that line is and stay within our scope of practice. And that's incredibly important. So the discussion that we often have around this is like, for sure, you can I say easily, but like once you get a grasp on this, you can easily help someone with their mindset as a coach, right? That's not something that requires like advanced degree in psychology. You can absolutely help people like break through negative thought patterns or uncover some of these core beliefs so they can start to really like tackle them. And that's all stuff that's absolutely within your scope of practice. But yeah, for sure, if it's like, oh man, we're uncovering some childhood trauma and that's why I know my eating behaviors are the way that they are, or I feel this way about myself, it's like, what you can do as a coach is help a client uncover that stuff, which could be truly life-changing. And then yes, they need to go take it to someone else, because you obviously are not helpful at that point to actually help them work through those things. But that doesn't mean, you need to stop coaching them either. Because I think sometimes coaches get worried that, okay, well, if I dive into some of this stuff and now it's like, okay, well, I can't help you anymore, then I just lost a client. Like that's not helpful to me either. Absolutely, that client can go work with a therapist while still working with you from a nutrition and fitness perspective, right? And then you guys can almost collaborate as a team. There's been countless times where I have worked with clients who have been with therapists, and me and the therapist had a relationship, right? So we would kind of work as like a team in tandem, which is great. It's amazing for the client if you're able to do that. So with that said, some like kind of rule of thumb that I like to share too with coaches is like, hey, here's something that you can kind of pay attention to realize whether or not this is something that you are actually equipped to handle. And something that we notice, like whether it's from like a depression perspective, anxiety perspective, like body image perspective, whatever, if you feel like the thing that your client is struggling with from a mental health and psychological perspective is impeding their like everyday practices and their everyday routine, and like it's getting in the way of things through their everyday life, like that's a huge red flag that this is probably not something that you're capable of helping them with. If they're stepping on the scale and that's messing with them to the point where they don't stop thinking about it throughout the day, it's getting in the way with like their food choices, and maybe they're talking about their scale weight and their body weight and their body changing to their husband so much that it's putting a strain on their relationship. Like those are things where it's like, oh, okay, I think we've gone a little bit too far. It's different, right? Whereas like 90% of the female population doesn't love seeing the number on the scale. Like that's different than how this could show up, and sort of like this could be a real mental health concern that I'm not capable of helping you with. So that's kind of like a big like rule of thumb for me, where I'm like, once it starts actually becoming an issue and you see it in their everyday life, or, you're working with someone who maybe had an eating disorder in the past, and you can really start to see where, this is starting to creep back in. Obviously have an honest discussion with your client and say, this is kind of what I'm seeing. Correct me if I'm wrong. Obviously this is your life and you know yourself the best, but I want to make sure that like you're getting the help that you deserve and I'm staying within my integrity as a coach. And like any client's going to respect that. Right. So I think at the end of the day, having a conversation with your client is probably always a good idea, because they could say, oh, no. Like it's not that bad. I just had a really rough like couple weeks. And they may unload other aspects of their life that have been stressful, that are causing them to care more about these things right now than they normally do. And you're like, okay, cool. So this is something I could help you with, versus someone else who's like, oh yeah, actually I used to have an eating disorder and this is kind of indicative of those same behaviors that I used to do. And it's like, all right, so then maybe this isn't somewhere I can help you with, So yeah, that's kind of like my general rules of thumb and guidelines when it comes to like towing that line.
Yeah. The impeding everyday routine, I think, is a really good one to call out. Even for people listening, if you're like, man, should I get a coach? Just being able to correctly define and understand what it is that you're needing to work on. A lot of people be like, oh, I need to lose weight. But it is that foundational thing where it's like, work with that therapist first, get to a place to where you're ready to then take that next step. It's kind of like a physical therapist, like get your ankle good, then work with a run coach. Running's not going to help if your ankle's still broken.
It's totally
still
fair.
Busted. Kind of coming back to something we were talking about earlier, just around the growth and fixed mindset, but it was a topic that was brought up. I was lucky enough to go to an Andrew Huberman presentation in Seattle a couple of weeks ago. And we were talking about neuroplasticity, and I know you, like, he's a neuroscientist and you have a very different background, still brain related, but he was talking about the concept of neuroplasticity is something that can be happening at all ages. And we have to actively work to keep our mind in a growth mindset state, because our brain is a prediction machine and it's constantly trying to shrink the amount of things that it's having to essentially predict for. And the idea of having a growth mindset is saying you are open to new opportunities and new answers that in a way would threaten your current reality and your current identity, even of self. And so what are some ways that people can really make sure that their environment, their community, their books are continuing to cultivate that growth mindset? Because if I just sit here and stare at a wall, I almost feel like my growth mindset will atrophy. Again, I don't know if that's necessarily true, but that's kind of how I took what he was talking about. And it's something that you got to sweep the floor every day is how I sometimes will see it.
Yeah. And that's interesting, because it's like, I think that there's two arguments here. One is like, your growth mindset will atrophy in this way if you're doing nothing and you are just staring at the wall. The other argument would be like, you're actually probably avoiding a lot of like fixed mindset makers too. Right. I think about this a lot, because in the work that I did while I was still in academia and actively doing research, we would quite literally like shift people's mindsets in the lab by having them read a news article that was fake in either the direction of a growth or a fixed mindset, right? So for instance, like with weight loss, you would have a like Psychology Today article that's not real, one that essentially has them start to think about weight loss as something that is genetic and that they're like predisposed to or to not. So if like you're struggling with it now, that's probably like a genetic predisposition that puts you there. So that's like a very fixed mindset way of looking at things. Whereas the other one would be like, oh no, we have plenty of research that shows that people can lose weight. It doesn't matter what their genetic makeup is, all of these things, very much so like a growth mindset oriented way of thinking. And what is amazing is just reading those articles is enough to shift someone's mindset. Granted, we don't know if that lasts like long term, but all I can think about is like people who are writing messages on Instagram, on Facebook, all of these things, and other people are reading them, and there could very well be like fixed mindset type of messages in there that people are subconsciously consuming, and it is altering their mindset, so some of this stuff like freaks me out. Like it's just like, it's almost like too easy for people to be like have this like malleable mindset. So that said, I think neuroplasticity, I guess, could kind of like work in either of those ways. But I mean, the coolest thing about neuroplasticity and the way that we would use it in the research too, when it came to mindset, is describing it as like, if your brain can change, like what makes you think that you can't? This is like the ultimate clear like growth mindset message. Like your brain is constantly changing and constantly creating these new connections and getting rid of like old connections. So that could be like new and healthy habits are being created, and old and unhealthy habits can get kind of like pruned back over time. So being able to describe what neuroplasticity is, how it works, how your brain is constantly changing is actually like a growth mindset message in and of itself. And that's something that like even I created a growth mindset intervention for children in obesity clinics. And a big part of that was like explaining this brain science to them, obviously in the most simple terms, because they're like 8 to 12 years old. But this is, I mean, literally something that we would use to help shift kids' mindsets to be more growth mindset oriented when it comes to like health and fitness behaviors, is to describe that their brain is changing, right? So not only is like neuroplasticity like the perfect example of like a growth mindset, because like your mind is literally like growing, but it is also just explaining how it works and that it exists can help someone start to cultivate a growth mindset, right? So it is really cool, and it fits really well into this dialogue, into this narrative of growth mindset. So that said, kind of your idea of, do we need to like keep up with this? Like, how do I need to be listening to like some sort of like personal development book every day? Otherwise I lose this thing, like what's going on? The whole, like, if you don't use it, you lose it type of situation. And I think it's tough because obviously people who are always seeking to grow and to improve and stuff, they are the ones listening to these books, these podcasts, and really trying to continue to develop themselves. They always know that there's more that they could be doing. Yes, that's helpful, but at the same time, growth mindset isn't just about like consuming these things and these messages, these podcasts and books and all these things. Like if you read Carol Dweck's book about mindset, like you do not have more of a growth mindset by the end of it. Technically, maybe on like a scale basis you might, but until you actually are out in the real world and like you're faced with setbacks and obstacles and you're like, what do I do with this? And a growth mindset person, right, would take that as information and learn from it and get better from it and then continue to push on. Or someone with a fixed mindset would see this as like, okay, well, I guess I can't do this. This isn't for me, you know. It's in those situations where your growth mindset really shines and really has the opportunity to grow, right? And there's a lot of different examples of that where actual real life situations happen, and how you react to those things will do more for your mindset than say reading a book or a news article or whatever, right? But of course those things can still, it all comes together. It's all part of it. And in addition to like the people you surround yourself with and the conversations that you have and like how you start your mornings and your, I mean, all of it will make an impact on your mindset. So I think keeping that in mind too can be helpful, hopefully not like overwhelming that you need to be doing like 9 million things a day in order to keep your like growth mindset up to snuff. But I think just always kind of just being on the lookout for, where's my fixed mindset showing up? How do I reframe? You know, how can I think about this in a growth mindset manner? Like that's ultimately, if you're doing that, like you're probably in pretty good shape.
Yeah. Would you say that there's anything to be said around persistence too, and in taking action and failing and still persisting and not letting that close you up?
100%. It's called self-efficacy. So we actually have a term for it in psychology. It often gets like confused with self-esteem or self-confidence, but really when we're talking about self-efficacy, we're specifically talking about your ability to continue to work towards something in the face of obstacles, challenges, setbacks, things like that. So that persistence piece is self-efficacy. And what's cool is that we know actually some of the research that I did on mindset when it comes to like fitness behaviors and exercise frequency is that having a growth mindset about fitness will lead you to exercise more frequently, but it's really not like this direct like growth mindset to more exercise connection. What's happening is that having a growth mindset actually increases your self-efficacy when it comes to fitness, which in turn leads to more frequent exercise. So it's really that mediator in the middle, that variable in the middle of self-efficacy that's causing you to exercise more frequently through like starting with growth mindset, right? And I don't really have the information on this, but I'm sure just like based on like my expertise in the area that it goes the other way too, that if you have more self-efficacy and like belief in yourself to continue to pursue things through like hardship and challenges and things like that, that's probably going to give you more of a growth mindset too, right? So they probably play together back and forth, and that kind of, that relationship in tandem is what is actually going to lead you to be a more frequent exerciser than someone else, right? There's a couple other variables too that kind of fall in that middle ground that growth mindset ultimately impacts, which leads to you being a more frequent exerciser. But yeah, long story short, self-efficacy, that like persistence piece is a really, really, really big part in behavior change, especially when it comes to like long-term sustained behavior change.
Yeah, that's cool. Is there any overlap with self-efficacy and competency as it relates to self-determination theory? Is that anything that you spent time researching or things that you take into account with clients?
I don't know off the top of my head if we have anything that kind of like looks at whether or not like competence and self-efficacy are really truly like separate things, right? There are plenty of studies that look at like different terms. Like sometimes people will put like grit and growth mindset into certain like algorithms, and like when people are using rating scales to see where they're at, a lot of times we can't separate the difference between the two. So we're like, are these different constructs or not? So in this case with like competency, I could see, I mean, you probably, right, at face value, it's like you probably feel like you're a more competent person if you also feel like you can work through like difficulties and setbacks and obstacles on the way to your goals, right? If you're doing that, you probably feel a little bit more competent. And vice versa, right? Like if you can show it to yourself that like, man, I just went through some hard shit to get here, like you probably feel like a pretty competent person, right? So I could see where there could be some overlap. I don't know for sure that like if they are truly like different constructs or not. But that makes a lot of sense to me that like it would be embedded sort of in that framework of like, we're talking about autonomy, belongingness, and competence. Those are like the three basic psychological needs that find themselves inside self-determination theory. So with those needs, like humans are like driven and like motivated to meet those needs. And when those needs are being met, they're also like more motivated to do things. So yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me because that would all then work together from like a growth mindset perspective, right? So yeah, that's an interesting thought.
Yeah, that's cool. It's stuff to, I don't know, continue to dive into.
Yeah, I feel like I'm going far into this rabbit hole. Maybe I should just
well, I mean, it makes sense. Like if you're good at something, you're going to believe that you can be good at other things. You have evidence that you've been good. And so why shouldn't you be good again at something else?
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned something interesting just around social media. And I don't know if this is the correct term, but just the concept of social contagion, where people will see on social media a belief, a statement, a post, and then they will take someone having that experience, that condition, and then they will absorb that meaning. And kind of tied to this, I was curious if there's anything you saw as, you know, in your profession, in research around the concept of, you know, gratitude, manifestation, law of attraction. You talked about just being able to read a you know, Psychology Today article, even if it was true or not, was able to change the mindset. Are these things enough to change like biochemistry and physiology?
Man, I mean, probably, you know, I mean, okay, so what we know of how just like the mind and the body interact, right? Like, for instance, stress is a really good example of this. Stress is 110% perceived. Like, for sure, there are situations where like we would assume are just inherently stressful. You get into a car accident, right? Like, that is a stressful situation. But if it's, let's call it, it's a fender bender, right? Not a huge deal. One person may like react like very horribly, feel super stressed out, super anxious, be like crying, like super heavy on the emotions, whereas another person could get on the car and be like, okay, what is the next step? What do we need to do? You know, I know that if I stay calm and cool and collected, everything's going to go a lot smoother. We'll be able to figure out like what the next step is, and we need to like execute on that, right? So obviously, one person feeling enormously stressful versus the other, like that's going to influence you on a physiological level when it comes to like your cortisol, right? So that is like your main primary stress hormone. So that is all coming from a place of psychology, right? So you can really, truly have the handle on your cortisol levels by how you respond to things. And that's your mindset deciding like, what does this mean to me in this situation? So I don't know how much, like, oh, I'm sure like people are, I don't know cortisol well enough to tell you whether or not it can rise like that quickly and make an impact. But I would assume, you know, you're scrolling through social media and it's like a lot of stressful things like going on in the world, and like people are posting about like really stressful situations, and like, or just like, man, turn on the news and I feel like your cortisol levels are going to rise at any day,
No
because
kidding.
it's just all sensationalized material and like a lot of like negative information and things like this. I can't imagine that's good for your cortisol levels and your stress levels and things like that. But again, a lot of that you can't control. That doesn't mean just like turn it off, or, don't scroll social media. It's like, maybe you can actually like catch yourself while you're scrolling or you're watching the news, and like, do you notice like your heart rate picking up, your hands getting sweaty, you feel a little bit more like anxious and like uptight, and like, why all of a sudden do I feel like my chest is being like constricted? And like, if you're noticing some of these symptoms in yourself, you can truly like take a step back and control it and try to calm yourself down and sort of like reframe the situation. So I don't know. I feel like I answered your question in a very like roundabout way, because I don't know exactly like how much like, oh, you go read that stressful Instagram post, your cortisol is going to go through the roof. Like, I don't know if it's going to be like that immediate. But ultimately, like, we are living in a world of just chronic stress, from whether it is social media or work or relationships or never feeling like we're doing enough, like that is the society we live in, and it is like a high cortisol stressed out world. So I'm sure it is a contributor.
Yeah. I think one or two things that I think is so ingrained in our society is social media and is alcohol, and just the belief and mindset around those two things. I wish I could, work with someone or have a conversation with someone like, hey, try 2 weeks without it, see how you feel. Now you create a wider spectrum of what you can feel like versus what you do feel like. And you might feel like you feel good, but you've just normalized not feeling good.
Mm-hmm.
How do you approach those two things? Because again, that is like so ingrained, and taking someone's alcohol or taking someone's social media is like taking someone's guns. Like, they're going to fight you tooth and nail about that.
Yeah. Oh, it's a good topic too, because something I use, it's a tool that I've coined. It's called momentary restriction. So like, I don't think super restrictive practices are ever a great idea when it comes to like the health and fitness world, or anything for that matter. But in small doses, it can help you learn a lot. It can be a really good exercise. So this is actually, if you were to sign up for the waitlist for my certification, one of the 5 free lessons that I send to waitlisters is about momentary restriction. And I actually use alcohol as an example for this. So it came from a client who, she was very much like realizing her energy levels were low. She has these couple glasses of wine every single night, but she says that is what helps her like calm down at the end of the day. And I mean, ultimately 2 glasses of wine, like most nights of the week, can fit your macros. It's not going to be too horrible for you. But my thought was like, hey, do you think that the couple glasses of wine most nights of the week is what's impacting how you're feeling? And she's like, well, I don't really know, because it's been so long since that hasn't been part of like my routine. And I said, hey, how about we just cut it out for at least the next week, like until next check-in, and just take note every day. We're going to use this as an experiment to see how you feel. If you notice like your energy levels being any different, how you feel at the gym, pay attention to your hunger levels, your sleep quality. Let's just like really like go all in for 1 week, and then we'll decide what needs to happen going forward. Like, definitely not going to take it away, like I promise, right? So most people can do anything for 1 week, right? Especially if it means like, okay, so you're going to give it back to me afterwards type of thing. And what was great is that she did realize like, okay, this was impacting like my sleep, which was impacting my energy. I woke up and felt like I didn't need the coffee as much as I normally do, that sort of thing. So it led her to not stopping drinking altogether. She truly didn't want to, but it did lead her to drinking less. So now it was like, okay, 3 nights a week, I'm going to have a glass of wine. And like, that's already a much better, improved thing, right? But until you can really experience it and experiment with it, it's hard to know. So I do love that practice. It's like using restriction in very small amounts instead of like across the board for like everything that we're doing, just in order to get a better picture, get a better idea. You can use it the other way too, and like add something in for a short period of time too, to kind of experiment that way. And I think the more you can get into that, like, I'm the experimenter, I'm the researcher of my own life, and I'm using this to collect data on myself, the better, because then you can be a little bit more objective with it. You can take it like seriously, but not take it super personally. And that can be super, super helpful. But with that said, what was the other half of your question? I feel like there was another half.
Oh, it was
Like,
social media or
uh,
so it's like, hey, don't scroll on TikTok until midnight. Hey,
mhm,
don't have alcohol for a week. How would you feel if you
yeah.
didn't do those things? And most
Mhm.
people are like, wow, I feel amazing. And then when they go back
Yeah.
to drinking, they're like, wow, I'm hungover
Yes,
after like
that's what it
one
was.
drink.
Yeah.
And it's like,
Mhm.
maybe that's how you've been for the last like
Yeah.
3 years.
And yeah, that's actually something I made like it was a post, I want to say maybe like 4th of July last year. So literally like a year ago. Maybe I need to repost
Yeah.
it.
Send
But
it up again.
yeah, right. But it was essentially like a graph, and it was something that we always notice with our clients, like during like holiday weekends like this, whereas typically, prior to maybe starting coaching, their weekends were filled with like drinks and overeating and crappy food and stuff like that. And as we start to kind of like reframe and rework some of their lifestyle and their habits and their mindset and all this stuff, and they now live a generally healthy lifestyle, it's like that feeling of where you're unhealthy normal, then you go through a weekend like 4th of July weekend, they feel pretty similar. Like, oh, I'm a little bit more hungover than usual, but otherwise I feel like my normal self. Whereas like once you start to make some of these big changes in your life and you live a healthier lifestyle, the difference between a weekend like 4th of July weekend where you are indulging and what your normal life looks like is massive. Like you can really feel that difference, right? Whereas so they'll come to us and say like, I don't know why I feel so wrecked. Like I used to live like this all the time. It's like, that's why. It's like
Yeah.
you're used to like living in that space. So that can be like really, really eye-opening, and having that conversation with clients when they do present that, instead of just being like, oh yeah, that's great. I'm glad you feel so much like you're not feeling, I'm not glad you're feeling horrible, but like, I'm glad that you're like realizing that like, yes, living a healthy lifestyle is great, but like actually having them reflect on how they used to feel and why, and asking them, well, why do you think that was? And having a full conversation about that can be a game changer. So like, don't sleep on that when clients recognize those things, or they start to recognize like, oh, I'm actually craving healthy foods, or I wasn't really actually interested in binge drinking over the weekend like I used to be. Like, don't just like, good job, let's keep going. Like, talk about that. Like, that's huge. We really want to like leverage that. So really great conversations to have. And I think a lot of times too, like with the momentary restriction, I like it too, because a lot of times it's a band-aid practice to be like, well, unfollow those people, or, just stop buying the alcohol, or get rid of the Oreos that are in your pantry if they're so hard for you to eat. And to me, I'm like, that doesn't actually solve the issue at hand. And like, we should still want them to be able to scroll on social media and have wine and have the Oreos when they want to, just in like a healthier manner that makes them feel good, right? So like getting to that is more important than just like getting rid of it altogether.
Yeah, totally. And putting it into more of like a hell yes, like I'm eating these Oreos because I want these Oreos and they're going to
Yes.
taste so good. And like, I want this drink because it's a hell yes moment or a hell yes opportunity. I think a thing that's interesting about food, if you look at people like who get addicted to things or like they struggle with overconsumption, we still need food to eat. And so you still need to like have it, but you need to be able to wean off it if you're like take it all the way to obesity. Whereas if someone's addicted to like gambling, you'd be like, okay, like don't gamble just a little bit every day. Like you have to cut gambling out. And so I always find that an interesting balance to strike with food and with nutrition, because
Yeah,
it's
that's true.
something you're trying to adjust how the brain is perceiving the food, but you can't eliminate it altogether. But I like what you talked about, where it's momentary restriction of something to where you can reset, whether that is from a dopamine standpoint or a perception standpoint, or just having a new baseline and just widening the gap where it's like you used to feel
Yep.
like Hell Island. Now you feel like Heaven Island. What if you did this for a year? And they're like, whoa, that would be
Right.
cool.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And I've even like been in situations like that for myself. Like I cut out dairy for a period of time, and like I'm a really big like chocolate lover. So keep the chocolate in the freezer, and I would like go grab some pieces every once in a while, which was like totally fine. It fit in my diet, it was not a big deal. I was not like eating a chocolate bar a day or anything, but I had to cut it out for a period of time. And unintentionally, like when I started adding dairy back in, I totally forgot about the chocolate in the freezer thing, right? Like it's just like, oh wow, I haven't actually had that in a really long time, and I used to have that every single day. So it's just like, even unintentionally, it's like when you take a break from something, you realize like, wow, that's not actually something that's on my radar as much. It was just so habitual to like open the freezer drawer and grab some. So that same thing can kind of like translate.
yeah, man, there's so many things that I feel like we could dive into and have so much fun talking about. Do want to be respectful of your time. The one last question, this is totally off the cuff. but is there anything that you would love to see like in research, or what's like a big revelation or something that you are looking forward to, whether it's a project you're working on or a project people are working on, or a project you want to be done, so you could be like and have the answer to this one thing that obviously wouldn't
Yeah.
unlock everything, but would unlock a big thing for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's funny because I feel like since I haven't been actively doing research anymore, and now I get all of the ideas for it. I'm like, man, like if I only do that, then. What I will say though is like during like a PhD timeline, you are kind of on like crunch time. It's like you need to do the things that you could actually get done. Otherwise, you're going to be here for freaking forever. So I really wanted to do my dissertation on women and strength training and how that made an impact in their mindset or vice versa. So that was really what I wanted to spend time in, but I just could not get funding for it. I could not figure out how I was going to make it happen in the amount of time that I wanted to get my PhD done in and not be there for like 8 years. So that's where I went into I got handed actually an opportunity to work with children in obesity clinics. And I was like, I got to do this instead. So I think that's kind of like my shoe-in response, right? Is like, I would love to see more research pertaining to women in strength training and how that affects their mindset and how maybe then that shows up in other areas of their life. Because we see that sort of like anecdotally, but we don't have any real research to show that like strength training actually can help with your mindset, which can help with all of this other stuff. Or if you have a growth mindset, you're more likely to stick with strength training and have all of these incredible results. I would like to see some of those relationships kind of experimented with a little bit more. That would be cool. I also like one of the bigger questions that does come up for me a lot. It's like, again, anecdotally, I see it. And I think it makes sense that like, you're kind of like alluding to this too. I think that if you have a growth mindset in one area, that like you're kind of proving it to yourself that you can do things. So then it should provide evidence for other areas. Like that makes sense to me, but like we don't have any research to support that. Like we don't have any research that says, because we do know mindset's domain specific, meaning you can have a fixed mindset in your career, but have a growth mindset in your relationships. So because of that, I'm like, okay, well, if you have a growth mindset in your relationship, can't you just translate it over into your workplace? Like that's what we would hope, right? But we don't have any research that shows that's actually something that is more likely to happen and is more likely to like be done, right? Or those people will just be stuck with their growth mindset here and fixed mindset there. So yeah, those are a couple things that like immediately come to mind for me.
That's so interesting. Just being able to transfer the architecture of what makes you successful in one avenue to another, right? And whether it's health, relationships, and career, and be like, all right, we're going to take this framework and apply this here and just like build it the same way you did. But
Right.
wow, I
Exactly.
haven't
And
thought about
you'd
that.
think like we can do that, right? But yeah,
Yeah.
and I also think a lot of it probably comes down to people like needing a coach in their corner or someone to help them kind of like figure that out, because there is something called the taking strengths for granted effect. And again, something very makes sense at face value. Like most people don't realize like what they're actually good at, because we just don't like to give ourselves credit all of the time. We focus on like the negative things and our weaknesses all of the time. So you almost need like an outside person, like an outside perspective to help you uncover what those strengths are. And then now how can we leverage that for some of these other areas that you are trying to work on? So yeah.
Wow. The stress is 110% perceived, the domain specific. Like there's a few things that I'm like, wow, it's unlocking more questions, honestly, which is probably your entire experience. But this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for the time and love the conversation. And where can people find you to get more of this information, whether that's social media, your website, one-on-one coaching, because obviously this is just the tip of one iceberg.
Oh my God, just scratching the surface for sure. So I spend most of my time as far as like social media and free content and just like free workshops and stuff like that. You can all find on my Instagram for the most part. So I'm Coach Kasey Joe over there. It's Coach with a C, but Kasey with a K, and Joe without an E. I'm trying to get into the world of TikTok, but bear with me for that. You're like,
it's the wild, wild west.
It really is. Oh my gosh. So I'm Coach Kasey Joe over there too, if you happen to be on TikTok and you care. But as far as like learning any more about like one-on-one health and fitness coaching or diving into the health mindset coaching certification, if you're a coach or a health professional, you can find information about all of that and all of my programs at my website, which is www.kjocoaching.com.
Cool. Sweet. And we'll have the links to all that and tag in all the stuff. And again, thank you so much for taking the time. And hopefully you got a fun 4th of July planned. And get to
Not really,
take some
honestly.
time. Hey, sometimes
I'm staying home and not going somewhere for once this year.
sometimes
So,
no plans is the best plans. You just
honestly,
hang with the pets.
looking
And
forward to it.
yeah, cool. Well, again, thank you
Yeah,
so much, and wish you the best.
awesome. Thank you.